My hands trembled as I clutched my folder of evidence and walked into the courtroom. My parents, Robert and Diana Wilson, rolled their eyes dramatically when they saw me. Dad whispered something to Mom, who nodded with a smirk. But then something unexpected happened. As Judge Harris reviewed my documentation, his expression shifted from neutral to visibly surprised. He looked at me, then at my parents, then back at the papers before him. That's when I knew this was going to be different. If you're watching this video about family betrayal and justice, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. The support of this community has meant everything during this difficult journey. Before I continue my story about confronting my parents in court, please consider subscribing to hear more stories about standing up to family manipulation. Now, let me take you back to where it all began, when I discovered the truth about my inheritance. Growing up as Rachel Wilson, the only child of Robert and Diana Wilson, looked picture-perfect from the outside. My father was a prominent tax attorney with connections throughout our city, and my mother was a successful real estate agent who prided herself on her social connections. We lived in a sprawling colonial home in an exclusive neighborhood, and our family portraits showed 3 smiling people in coordinating outfits. But behind closed doors, life was different. From my earliest memories, I understood that nothing less than perfection was acceptable in the Wilson household. A 98% on a test meant a lecture about the missing 2%, not celebration for what I'd achieved. My schedule was meticulously planned: piano lessons on Mondays and Wednesdays, ballet on Tuesdays and Thursdays, French tutoring on Fridays, and additional study sessions on weekends. "Rachel, your future depends on these foundations," my father would say whenever I expressed interest in anything outside their approved activities. "You can't afford to waste time like other children." My mother was particularly concerned with appearances. By age 12, she was monitoring my food intake, criticizing my posture, and selecting my clothes. "No daughter of mine will look sloppy," she'd say, discarding outfits I liked in favor of what she deemed appropriate. "People judge our entire family by how you present yourself." Friends were carefully vetted. Anyone whose parents weren't in my parents' social circle was automatically suspicious. Sleepovers were rare, and when they happened, my mother would quiz me afterward about the other family's home, possessions, and conversations. "I'm just looking out for you," she'd insist when I protested. "You're too trusting, Rachel. Not everyone deserves to be in your life." The only refuge I had was with my maternal grandparents, Evelyn and Harold Montgomery. Visiting them was like stepping into another world. My grandmother never criticized my appearance or grades. Instead, she listened to my thoughts, encouraged my interests, and slipped me books on topics I enjoyed but my parents disapproved of. "You have a wonderful mind, Rachel," Grandma Evelyn would tell me. "Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise." My grandfather taught me to fish, build birdhouses, and change a tire, much to my mother's dismay. "She doesn't need those skills," my mother would argue. "She needs to focus on academics and social graces." The tension between my mother and grandmother was constant but usually expressed in tight smiles and pointed comments. Once, though, I overheard an argument that stayed with me. "Diana, you're suffocating that child," my grandmother said. "Mother, you don't understand modern parenting," my mother replied coldly. "We're preparing Rachel for success, not coddling her like you want to." "There's a difference between preparation and control," my grandmother countered. "One day, you'll regret not letting her become her own person." When I was 15, I got my first summer job at a local bookstore, against my parents' wishes. They insisted I should be doing an internship at my father's firm instead, but for once, I held my ground. The small paychecks I earned felt like freedom, until my father announced he'd opened a bank account for me. "We'll manage this money for your college expenses," he said, holding out his hand for my latest paycheck. "You don't understand financial management yet." I later learned that my parents had withdrawn most of that money for what they called family expenses. When I questioned this in my senior year, needing funds for a school trip, my father became indignant. "After all we've invested in you, you're concerned about a few $100s? Do you have any idea what your lessons and private schooling cost?" The pattern continued through college. I attended my father's alma mater to study accounting, though I'd wanted to explore art or journalism. Impractical majors for dreamers, my father had said dismissively. Accounting gives you stability. During those years, my relationship with my grandparents became my emotional lifeline. When Grandma Evelyn became ill during my junior year, I spent as much time with her as possible, often drawing criticism from my parents for neglecting my studies. Before she passed away, my grandmother held my hand and said something that puzzled me at the time. "Rachel, one day you'll understand what we tried to do for you. When that day comes, remember that you deserve to choose your own path. Don't let fear keep you silent." I didn't understand what she meant then. 3 years later, when my grandfather passed away too, I still didn't know. By then, I was 27, living in a modest apartment, working an accounting job I tolerated but didn't love, and struggling with student loan debt my parents had promised to handle but mysteriously couldn't when the time came. "We've had some unexpected financial setbacks," my mother explained vaguely when I asked why they couldn't help as promised. "You're an adult now, Rachel. It's time you stood on your own feet." Meanwhile, they had renovated their kitchen, purchased a vacation condo, and my father had bought a new luxury car. Something didn't add up, but years of conditioning had taught me not to question them too deeply. After my grandfather passed away, the responsibility of clearing out my grandparents' house fell to me. My mother claimed she was too emotionally fragile to handle her parents' belongings, and my father was too busy with an important case. In reality, I suspect they were more interested in knowing what assets might be coming their way than in preserving my grandparents' memories. The house was a modest 3-bedroom ranch that had always felt more like home than my parents' showplace. As I sorted through decades of my grandparents' life together, I found myself lingering over photographs, books, and handwritten notes that revealed dimensions of them I hadn't known. On my third day of clearing, I was examining my grandfather's antique mahogany desk when I noticed something odd about the bottom drawer. It seemed shallower from the outside than it was from the inside. Investigating further, I discovered a hidden compartment beneath a false bottom. Inside was a sealed manila envelope with my name written on it in my grandmother's distinctive handwriting. My heart pounding, I carefully opened it and spread the contents across the desk. What I found changed everything I thought I knew about my life. The first document was a trust fund agreement established when I was 5 years old. My grandparents had set aside a substantial portion of their savings and investments, placing them in a trust with me as the sole beneficiary. According to the terms, I was to receive access to the funds upon turning 21 or upon graduating college, whichever came later. I stared at the numbers in disbelief. The initial deposit had been just over $1 million, with additional contributions over the years. With interest and investments, the trust should have been worth well over $2 million by the time I graduated college. $2 million. Money that would have covered my student loans, allowed me to pursue a career I actually wanted, maybe even buy a home instead of renting my cramped apartment. Money I had never seen a penny of. The envelope contained more. Letters from my grandmother to her attorney expressing concern that my parents were attempting to access the trust funds, legal amendments strengthening the protections around the money, and finally, bank statements showing systematic withdrawals beginning shortly after my grandmother's death 3 years ago. The most recent statement, dated just 2 months before my grandfather's death, showed a balance of less than $50,000 remaining. My parents had taken it all. As the realization washed over me, memories began to align in a new, disturbing pattern. My parents' inexplicable affluence despite constant claims of financial strain. Their insistence on maintaining control of my earnings. The unexpected financial setbacks that prevented them from helping with my student loans, coinciding with their kitchen renovation and vacation property purchase. I felt physically ill. With shaking hands, I gathered the documents and left my grandparents' house, driving straight to a lawyer's office I'd found through a quick internet search. Jessica Patel was an estate attorney with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She reviewed the documents carefully while I sat across from her desk, still in shock. "Ms. Wilson," she said finally, looking up from the papers. "Based on what I'm seeing here, your parents have committed fraud." They had no legal right to access this trust. As the trustee after your grandmother's death, your grandfather should have been the only one with limited administrative access, and even he couldn't withdraw funds for his own use. How could they have gotten the money, then? I asked. Jessica frowned. Most likely by pressuring your grandfather or manipulating him after your grandmother's death. Possibly even forging documents. The fact that they kept this hidden from you is telling. But with these documents, we can prove it. Prove it? The idea of legally confronting my parents hadn't fully formed yet. Rachel, Jessica said gently, this isn't just a family disagreement. This is theft. Your grandparents worked hard to provide for your future, and your parents took that from you. You have every right to pursue this legally. I left her office with a scheduled follow-up appointment and a storm of emotions. Betrayal, certainly. Anger, absolutely. But underneath was something even more painful, the realization that my parents had never seen me as an independent person deserving of respect. I was a possession to be controlled, nothing more. That night, I spread the documents across my small kitchen table and allowed myself to imagine what my life might have been with financial security. I could have studied art. Traveled. Started a business. All the dreams I'd suppressed as impractical suddenly seemed to mock me from the paths not taken. And in that moment, surrounded by evidence of my parents' betrayal, I made a decision. I would fight for what was rightfully mine, not just for the money, but for the autonomy my grandparents had tried to ensure for me. Sunday dinner at my parents' house had been a mandatory weekly event since I moved out. Missing it without a pre-approved excuse resulted in days of texts, calls, and guilt trips. So the following weekend, I arrived at their house as usual, but with the trust documents hidden in my bag and a rehearsed speech in my mind. My mother greeted me with her standard once-over. Rachel, that blouse doesn't do anything for your figure. And couldn't you have done something with your hair? I swallowed the automatic apology that had been conditioned into me. It's nice to see you too, Mom. Dinner proceeded as normal. My father dominated the conversation with stories about his cases and clients, my mother interjected with gossip about neighbors and acquaintances, and I was expected to provide an appreciative audience. Usually, I obliged with appropriate nods and questions. This time, I remained quiet, waiting for the right moment. It came during dessert, as my mother served her signature apple pie. I need to discuss something important with you both, I said, interrupting my father's monologue about his golf game. Both my parents looked startled. I rarely initiated topics of conversation, let alone interrupted. What is it, Rachel? My father's tone suggested mild irritation at the disruption. I pulled out the trust documents and placed them on the table. I found these at Grandpa's house. I know about the trust fund, and I know what happened to the money. The shift in the atmosphere was immediate. My mother's hand froze in the act of serving pie. My father's face registered shock before quickly rearranging into stern authority. Those are private family financial matters, he said dismissively. Your grandparents meant well, but they didn't understand proper estate planning. $2 million, Dad. That's what was in the trust for me. Where is it? My mother recovered first, setting down the pie server with a clatter. Rachel, you don't understand. That money was never intended to go directly to you. Your grandparents established it, yes, but with the understanding that we would manage it. That's not what the documents say, I countered, pointing to the trust terms. It says clearly that the money becomes mine at age 21. I'm 27 now. Where is it? We're your parents, my father said, his voice hardening. We know what's best for you. You would have wasted it on foolishness if we'd given it to you at 21. We invested it for your future. Invested it? In what? Your kitchen renovation? Dad's new car? The condo in Florida? My mother's eyes narrowed. After all we've done for you. The sacrifices we've made. How could you be so ungrateful? I felt a familiar wave of guilt, followed by a surge of anger that pushed it aside. Sacrifices? You've controlled every aspect of my life since I was born. And now I find out you stole money that my grandparents left for me. Money that could have changed my life. We didn't steal anything, my father insisted, though his face had reddened. We made parental decisions about funds that were ultimately family money. I pulled out the bank statements. These withdrawals happened after I was legally entitled to the trust. Large withdrawals that coincide exactly with your major purchases and renovations. That's theft, Dad. It's fraud. My father stood abruptly, looming over me as he had when I was a child. That's enough. I will not be accused in my own home by my own daughter. You have no idea what it takes to maintain this family's position. Your grandparents were naive about money. We did what was necessary. Necessary for who? I asked, standing up to face him. Not for me. I'm struggling with student loans you promised to pay. I'm stuck in a career I hate because you insisted it was the only acceptable choice. Meanwhile, you're using my inheritance to fund your lifestyle. My mother switched tactics, her face crumpling into a practiced expression of distress. Rachel, this stress isn't good for my blood pressure. You know the doctor said I need to avoid upset. I've consulted an attorney, I said, ignoring the familiar manipulation. Jessica Patel. She confirms that what you did was illegal. The mention of an attorney transformed both my parents. My father's face hardened into the cold expression I'd seen him use when discussing adversaries. If you pursue this legally, you need to understand the consequences, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. You will no longer be welcome in this home. Your position at Kingston Accounting, which I arranged for you, will become precarious. Many of your so-called friends will discover that their loyalty lies with us, not you. And think of what this will do to the family name, my mother added. Everyone will be talking about us. Is that what you want? To drag our family through public scandal? I looked around the dining room with its expensive furniture and designer decor, all familiar elements of a life that had never truly been mine. For the first time, I saw my parents clearly, not as the all-powerful authorities of my childhood, but as two deeply insecure people who valued control and appearances above their own daughter's well-being. I'm not the one who created this situation, I said quietly. You stole from me. You lied to me. For years, you've controlled every aspect of my life while pretending it was for my own good. I'm giving you one chance to make this right. Return what's left of the money, acknowledge what you did, and we can try to rebuild our relationship from a healthier place. My father laughed, actually laughed. You're in no position to issue ultimatums, Rachel. We're your parents. We know what's best. Drop this nonsense now, and we'll forgive your temporary insanity. In that moment, something broke and reformed inside me. The last threads of the obedient daughter they had created snapped, and in her place stood someone new, someone stronger. I'll see you in court, I said, gathering my documents. Don't contact me again except through my attorney. As I walked toward the door, my mother called after me, You'll regret this, Rachel. You're nothing without us. Perhaps the old Rachel would have crumbled under those words. But I kept walking, my back straight, my resolve hardening with each step. The weeks following my confrontation with my parents were a crash course in legal proceedings, financial forensics, and emotional endurance. Jessica Patel became not just my attorney but my guide through the complicated process of holding my parents accountable. The good news, Jessica explained during one of our early meetings, is that your grandparents created an exceptionally solid trust. The terms are unambiguous, and your parents had no legal right to access those funds without your knowledge or consent. Then how did they get the money? I asked. That's what we're going to find out. I've submitted requests for all banking records related to the trust, as well as your grandfather's financial records after your grandmother's death. The discoveries came in waves, each more disturbing than the last. First, we learned that my father had used his legal knowledge to create documents giving him power of attorney over my grandfather after my grandmother died. The signature on those papers was questionable at best, especially compared to other documents my grandfather had signed during the same period. He took advantage of Grandpa's grief, I realized, staring at the power of attorney form. Grandpa was devastated after Grandma died. He would have been vulnerable. Jessica nodded grimly. Unfortunately, elder financial abuse often comes from family members who know exactly when and how to exploit vulnerabilities. Then we discovered that my parents had taken out student loans in my name, loans I'd been repaying thinking they were legitimately mine. Meanwhile, they had used trust money that should have covered my education expenses for their own purposes. This crosses into identity theft, Jessica said, adding the loan documents to our growing file of evidence. Each new revelation strengthened our case but deepened my emotional turmoil. How could the people who raised me, who claimed to love me, have systematically deceived and stolen from me? How had I never seen through their manipulations? Don't blame yourself, Jessica advised, noticing my distress. You were conditioned from childhood to trust and obey them. They exploited that trust. That's on them, not you. The next blow came when I discovered they had leveraged my credit without my knowledge to secure additional loans. My perfect credit score, which I had maintained with careful diligence, had been compromised by accounts I never knew existed. As our court date approached, the pressure from my extended family intensified. My mother's sister, Aunt Barbara, called me repeatedly, leaving voicemails that oscillated between pleading and threatening. Rachel, whatever issues you have with your parents, legal action is not the answer. Family matters should stay private. Your reputation will never recover from this. When I finally answered one of her calls, prepared to politely but firmly stand my ground, Aunt Barbara surprised me. Look, I can't say this is the approach I would take, she said, her voice lower than usual, but I want you to know something. Your mother and father did the same thing to your Uncle James years ago. Your father convinced him to invest in a business venture, took control of the money, and James never saw a penny of returns. It destroyed him financially. He's never been the same. This new information stunned me. Why didn't anyone ever talk about this? Your father threatened legal action if James spoke up. And your mother, well, she can make life very difficult for family members who cross her. Just be careful, Rachel. They fight dirty. Her warning proved accurate. Within days, I received a call from my boss at Kingston Accounting. Rachel, he began awkwardly, I've always valued your work here, but I've received some concerning feedback from important clients about potential instability in your personal life. Is there anything you'd like to discuss? I knew immediately what had happened. Mr. Daniels, I'm involved in a legal matter concerning family finances. It's being handled professionally and has no bearing on my work performance. I suspect certain parties may be attempting to create problems for me professionally as a pressure tactic. There was a long pause. I see. Well, I hope you'll handle these family matters privately. We value discretion here. The implication was clear, my father's connections were being leveraged against me. It wasn't the last such incident. Former family friends suddenly became distant. Invitations dried up. My landlord called to casually inquire if I was planning to renew my lease, mentioning he'd received an inquiry about my rental history. One evening, I returned home to find subtle signs that someone had been in my apartment, a chair slightly out of place, my desk drawer not fully closed, papers rearranged. Nothing was missing, but the violation was clear. Someone, almost certainly my parents, had accessed my home while I was at work. I changed my locks the next day and installed a basic security camera. The final straw came in the form of anonymous calls and messages, some threatening exposure of fabricated personal information, others implying that pursuing the case would result in consequences. I reported these to Jessica, who added harassment to our growing list of complaints. When I felt my resolve wavering under the pressure, I would open the last birthday card my grandmother had given me before she died. Inside, she had written, "To my dear Rachel, who has more strength than she knows. Trust yourself." Those words became my anchor. If you've ever had to stand up against family pressure, you know how isolating it can feel. While preparing for my court date against my parents, there were moments I almost gave in to doubt. What kept me going were messages from people who'd been through similar situations and found their voice. Your support means everything to those of us sharing these difficult stories. If this resonates with your experience, I'd be grateful if you'd stay with me as I describe what happened when we finally had our day in court. As the court date approached, my parents escalated their campaign to pressure me into dropping the case. What had begun as isolated incidents transformed into a coordinated effort to isolate and discredit me. The rumors started subtly. Friends would ask if I was doing okay with concerned expressions. Colleagues began treating me with careful distance. Eventually, my cousin Melissa called to ask directly if I was receiving psychiatric treatment. "What are you talking about?" I asked, genuinely confused. "Aunt Diana mentioned you've been struggling with some mental health issues," Melissa said hesitantly. "She said the family is very concerned and supporting you through treatment." I was speechless for a moment. "That's completely false, Melissa. I'm not in treatment because I don't need to be. This is just their latest attempt to discredit me because I'm challenging them legally." "Oh." She sounded uncertain. "She seemed really worried about you." She was crying when she told us. My mother's ability to produce tears on command had been perfected over decades. I'd seen her sob dramatically during a disagreement, only to answer the phone seconds later in a perfectly composed voice. "Melissa, they took almost $2 million that my grandparents left specifically for me. They've been lying to me for years. Now they're spreading rumors about my mental health to make me look unstable. Does that sound like the actions of concerned parents to you?" There was a long pause. "I don't know what to believe, Rachel. This all seems so unlike Uncle Robert and Aunt Diana." That was the response I received from most family members. My parents had spent decades crafting their public image as successful, caring people. My version of them, the controlling manipulators who viewed me as property, seemed incomprehensible by comparison. The rumor spread beyond family. Former college classmates reached out, having heard I was experiencing difficulties. A client at work asked if I was feeling better after my episode. Someone even contacted an art studio where I occasionally took classes to express concern about my fragile state. Then the emotional manipulation intensified. A package arrived at my apartment containing my childhood teddy bear, along with photographs of me as a little girl with my parents. A handwritten note from my mother read, "Thinking of happier times. Family is everything." The calculated sentimentality made me feel physically ill. My father took a different approach. An envelope arrived containing documentation of every expense they had ever incurred on my behalf: private school tuition, summer camps, dance lessons, college fees. The total was meticulously calculated with a note reading, "Your ongoing ingratitude requires us to remind you of the investment we've made in you. Some debts can never be repaid." The message was clear: I was an ungrateful child who owed eternal obedience in exchange for being raised. I brought these items to Jessica, who added them to our evidence file. "This demonstrates their mindset perfectly," she said. "They view you as a financial transaction, not a person with autonomy. The judge should find this very interesting." The pressure at work increased. Mr. Daniels called me into his office again, looking uncomfortable. "Rachel, I've received calls from several board members expressing concerns about your continued employment here. Apparently, there's some legal matter involving your family?" "Yes, Mr. Daniels. As I mentioned before, I'm involved in recovering misappropriated inheritance funds. It's a private matter being handled through proper legal channels." He frowned. "Kingston Accounting values its reputation for stability and discretion. Perhaps you should consider a leave of absence until this is resolved? We're handling these family matters privately rather than through the courts." I recognized my father's influence immediately. Kingston's board included several of his golf partners. "Mr. Daniels, with all due respect, are you suggesting I should abandon a legitimate legal claim because it might make the firm uncomfortable? Would you give the same advice to a client whose funds had been misappropriated?" He had the grace to look embarrassed. "Of course not. But this is family, Rachel. Surely there's another way to resolve this?" If there were, I would have taken it, I replied. I'm exercising my legal rights to recover what's rightfully mine. If that's grounds for dismissal, I'll need that stated in writing with the specific company policy I've violated. He backed down, but the message was clear: my professional standing was precarious as long as I pursued the case. The most disturbing incident occurred when I returned home late one evening to find my apartment door slightly ajar. My new security camera had been disabled, but nothing appeared to be missing. Instead, things had been moved, examined, and replaced slightly differently. My private journal had been clearly read and returned to my desk at a different angle. Family photographs had been rearranged. It was a deliberate invasion meant to unsettle me, to remind me that they could access my private space at will. I filed a police report, but without clear evidence of forced entry or theft, there was little they could do. I changed my locks again and upgraded my security system. The anonymous calls became more frequent: heavy breathing, silence, or brief threatening messages like "drop the case if you know what's good for you or you'll regret this." I began recording these calls on Jessica's advice, adding them to our growing evidence of harassment. When I felt most alone and overwhelmed by their tactics, an unexpected ally emerged. My cousin Mark, whom I hadn't seen in years, contacted me through email rather than calling. "Rachel, I heard about what's happening with Uncle Robert and Aunt Diana. I want you to know that I believe you. They did something similar to my parents years ago. My dad, your Uncle Greg, loaned them money for what they claimed was a temporary financial emergency. They never repaid it and later claimed it was a gift when he asked for repayment. It caused a huge rift in the family. Mark's support was a lifeline, confirmation that I wasn't crazy or ungrateful for seeing my parents clearly. Everyone's afraid to stand up to them," he wrote. "They'd built their lives on manipulation and threats. I admire your courage for fighting back." His words strengthened my resolve. Each attempt my parents made to intimidate or discredit me only reinforced the rightness of my actions. The loving parents they pretended to be would never spread rumors about my mental health, invade my home, or threaten my livelihood. Their behavior revealed their true character more effectively than any argument I could make. As the court date finally arrived, I felt a strange calm replace my anxiety. My parents had deployed every weapon in their arsenal, and I was still standing. Whatever happened in court, I had already reclaimed something invaluable: my autonomy. The morning of the hearing, I dressed with particular care in a conservative navy blue suit and minimal jewelry. Jessica had advised projecting a professional, composed image, countering any impression my parents might have created of instability or irrationality. As I applied a light layer of makeup, I practiced the breathing techniques my new therapist had taught me for managing anxiety. "Remember," Jessica had said during our final preparation session, "Judge Harris has a reputation for being thorough and fair. Stick to the facts, answer questions directly, and let the evidence speak for itself. Your parents will likely try to make this about family loyalty and parental authority. Our job is to keep it focused on the legal issues." Walking into the courtroom, I spotted my parents immediately. They were seated with their attorney, Frederick Jameson, a longtime friend of my father's and partner at a prestigious firm. My mother wore a conservative dress in soft gray with a pearl necklace, the picture of elegant maternal concern. My father sat ramrod straight in an expensive suit, projecting authority and confidence. When they saw me, they exchanged glances, and my mother whispered something to my father. Then, in perfect synchronization, they both rolled their eyes dismissively. It was such a familiar gesture, one I'd seen countless times growing up whenever I expressed an opinion they disagreed with or made a request they considered unreasonable. That small, synchronized movement communicated years of condescension and dismissal. In that moment, I knew I had made the right decision in pursuing this case, regardless of the outcome. Judge Harris entered, and we all rose. He was an older man with silver hair and attentive eyes behind rimless glasses. As the proceedings began, Jessica presented our case first, outlining the establishment of the trust, its clear terms, and the systematic withdrawal of funds by my parents. "Your Honor, this is not a case about family disagreement," she stated firmly. This is about the illegal misappropriation of funds from a trust with explicit terms. Ms. Wilson's grandparents established this trust specifically to provide for her financial independence. The defendants deliberately concealed its existence from her and systematically depleted it for their personal use. Frederick Jameson presented my parents' defense next, painting a very different picture. Your Honor, Robert and Diana Wilson are devoted parents who have spent their lives guiding their somewhat impulsive daughter. The trust established by Mrs. Wilson's parents was always understood to be family money, to be managed by the most financially competent family members. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson used those funds for family purposes, including their daughter's education and well-being. Judge Harris reviewed the trust documentation carefully, his expression growing increasingly focused. He looked up at my parents' attorney. Mr. Jameson, the terms of this trust appear quite explicit. The beneficiary is clearly stated as Rachel Wilson, with funds to be transferred to her control upon reaching age 21 or college graduation, whichever came later. Can you point to any provision allowing the defendants access to these funds for their personal use? Jameson cleared his throat. Your Honor, family financial arrangements often involve informal understandings that may not be explicitly documented. The Wilsons believed they were acting within the spirit of the trust by managing these funds as part of overall family finances. Judge Harris frowned. The spirit of the trust? Mr. Jameson, I'm concerned with the legal terms, which appear to have been violated. He turned to my father. Mr. Wilson, as an attorney yourself, you must have been aware that this trust was legally binding as written. My father stood, adjusting his tie with the confident gesture I'd seen him use before important presentations. Your Honor, my in-laws were well-intentioned but financially naive. They didn't understand the complexities of estate planning. As Rachel's parents, we were in the best position to ensure those funds were appropriately managed. Our daughter has always been somewhat irresponsible with money, and we were concerned she would waste her inheritance on frivolous pursuits. Jessica interjected. Your Honor, we have evidence that directly contradicts Mr. Wilson's characterization. Ms. Wilson has maintained excellent credit and financial responsibility despite the defendant's interference. Furthermore, we have documentation showing the defendants used trust funds for luxury purchases including a vacation property, high-end renovations, and a vehicle for Mr. Wilson's personal use. The judge turned to me. Ms. Wilson, when did you become aware of this trust's existence? I explained discovering the documents after my grandfather's death and outlined my attempts to resolve the matter privately before taking legal action. As the questioning continued, my father maintained his composed exterior, but I could see the tension in his jaw, a tell I recognized from childhood when things weren't going his way. My mother alternated between projecting maternal concern and dabbing at her eyes with a tissue when attention turned her way. The turning point came during Jessica's cross-examination of my father. Mr. Wilson, can you explain these bank transfers from the trust account to your personal accounts? She displayed the records on a screen visible to the court. My father shifted slightly. Those were reimbursements for expenses related to Rachel's upbringing and education. Interesting. And was the purchase of a 2020 Lexus ES for your personal use an expense related to your daughter's upbringing? Jessica asked, displaying the purchase agreement dated after my college graduation. A reliable vehicle was necessary for family transportation, including visits to Rachel, he replied, his voice hardening. And the Florida vacation property purchased in 2018? Was that also for Rachel's benefit, despite her never having visited it according to her testimony? My father's composure began to crack. Those funds were part of overall family resources. As parents, we made decisions about appropriate allocations. Mr. Wilson, Jessica continued relentlessly, did you disclose the existence of this trust to your daughter when she turned 21 as required by the trust terms? We didn't feel she was mature enough to handle that information, he said stiffly. So you deliberately withheld information about her legal inheritance. And then, you proceeded to withdraw funds from that trust for your personal use while your daughter struggled with student loan debt. Loans that, according to these documents, were taken out in her name without her knowledge, while trust funds that should have covered her education were being diverted to your accounts. My father's face flushed with anger. You're twisting the facts. Everything we did was for Rachel's own good. She's always been too easily influenced, too impractical. We protected her from her own poor judgment. Judge Harris interjected. Mr. Wilson, your daughter is 27 years old and appears to be a competent, professional adult. On what basis do you claim she lacks judgment? She wanted to study art, my father blurted out, as if this were damning evidence. Art, Your Honor. With her academic potential. We had to guide her towards sensible choices. The judge's expression remained neutral, but his eyes narrowed slightly. When my mother took the stand, she employed a different strategy, alternating between tears and expressions of maternal concern. We only wanted what was best for Rachel, she said, her voice trembling perfectly. Children don't always understand that parents have to make difficult decisions. This whole legal proceeding is breaking my heart. What kind of child sues her own parents? Jessica approached her calmly. Mrs. Wilson, can you explain why you accessed Ms. Wilson's apartment without permission on multiple occasions after she initiated this legal action? My mother's expression shifted to confusion. I don't know what you mean. I have a key for emergencies. So you admit entering her residence without her knowledge or consent? I was concerned about her. A mother has every right to check on her child's well-being. Jessica produced the police report I had filed. Moving personal items and reading private journals constitutes checking on her well-being? My mother's facade cracked slightly. I needed to understand what was going on with her. She's been so different lately, so defiant. Different how? By asserting her legal rights as an adult? By questioning your authority to take money that legally belongs to her? As the questioning continued, the court heard testimony about the anonymous threatening calls, the rumors about my mental health, and the pressure applied to my employer. Each piece of evidence further undermined my parents' presentation as concerned, loving parents. The most devastating moment came when Jessica called a surprise witness, Walter Green, my grandfather's former business partner and friend for over 40 years. Mr. Green, did Harold Montgomery ever discuss the trust he and his wife established for their granddaughter? Jessica asked. Yes, many times, Walter replied, his voice steady despite his age. Harold and Evelyn were concerned that their daughter and son-in-law were too controlling of Rachel. They established the trust specifically to ensure she would have financial independence from them when she reached adulthood. Did Mr. Montgomery ever express concern about his son-in-law's interest in the trust? Walter nodded gravely. In the months before his death, Harold told me he suspected Robert was pressuring him to change the trust terms. He refused, but worried about what might happen after he was gone. He asked me to keep copies of the original trust documents in case anything happened to his. And did Mr. Montgomery ever indicate he wanted the Wilsons to have access to those funds for their personal use? Absolutely not, Walter stated firmly. In fact, quite the opposite. He told me, that money is for Rachel to build her own life, not for Diana and Robert to control her through it. My parents' attorney attempted to paint Walter as a confused old man with a grudge against my father, but his testimony remained consistent and credible. As the evidence mounted against them, my parents' strategy shifted from denial to minimization. My father claimed there had been a misunderstanding about the trust terms. My mother suggested they had temporarily borrowed from the trust with every intention of repaying it. Judge Harris was clearly skeptical. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, these bank records show systematic withdrawals over 3 years with no evidence of any repayments. Moreover, these withdrawals coincide precisely with major purchases for your personal benefit. This appears to be a deliberate pattern of misappropriation, not a misunderstanding. In a final desperate move, my father claimed they had verbal permission from my grandfather to use the funds. Harold understood that family finances should be managed holistically, he insisted. Walter Green's testimony had already contradicted this claim, and Jessica then presented a recording from my grandfather's nursing home, made 6 months before his death, in which he explicitly stated his concerns about my parents' attempts to access the trust. As the hearing concluded, Judge Harris announced he would review all evidence and issue his ruling the following week. As we left the courtroom, I caught my mother glaring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, not the controlled anger of my childhood, but naked fury at being exposed. For the first time in my life, I didn't flinch under that gaze. Instead, I held her eyes steadily until she looked away first. 1 week later, we gathered again in the courtroom to hear Judge Harris's ruling. The intervening days had been strangely quiet. No calls or messages from my parents, no pressure from family members, no workplace incidents. The silence felt less like peace and more like the stillness before a storm. Judge Harris entered and delivered his ruling without preamble. Having reviewed all evidence and testimony in this case, I find in favor of the plaintiff, Rachel Wilson. The terms of the trust established by Harold and Evelyn Montgomery were unambiguous, and the defendants' actions constituted a clear violation of those terms and of their fiduciary responsibility. Relief washed over me, but the judge wasn't finished. The defendants are hereby ordered to provide full financial restitution of all funds withdrawn from the trust, plus accrued interest at the standard rate. Additionally, given the deliberate and systematic nature of these violations, the court imposes a penalty of $50,000. The defendants will also be responsible for all court costs and the plaintiff's legal fees. My father's face had gone pale, while my mother's expression shifted between disbelief and indignation. Furthermore, Judge Harris continued, given evidence of ongoing harassment, this court issues a temporary restraining order prohibiting the defendants from contacting the plaintiff directly, entering her residence, or approaching her workplace for a period of 90 days. He looked directly at my parents. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, I find your actions in this matter particularly troubling. As parents, you held a position of trust, which you violated for personal gain. As an attorney, Mr. Wilson, you exploited your legal knowledge to circumvent the clear intent of this trust. The court will be referring this matter to the State Bar Association for review of potential ethical violations. My father stood abruptly. This is outrageous. You're taking the word of an ungrateful child over her parents? We sacrificed everything for her. Mr. Wilson, Judge Harris replied sternly, control yourself or be held in contempt. The court's decision is based on documented evidence of systematic financial misappropriation, not on family sentiment. My father's face contorted with rage. You have no idea what we've done for her. She owes us everything she has, everything she is. Robert, stop, my mother hissed, tugging at his sleeve, her eyes darting around the courtroom as she realized how this outburst would appear. But my father was beyond concerns of appearance now. This isn't over, Rachel, he said, turning to me. You've made the biggest mistake of your life. Mr. Wilson. Judge Harris's voice cut through the courtroom. One more word and you will be spending the night in jail for contempt. Is that clear? My father fell silent, but his eyes burned with humiliation and rage. As the judge finalized the paperwork, my mother suddenly slumped in her seat, her hand pressed dramatically to her chest. I can't breathe, she gasped. My heart. It was a performance I'd seen countless times growing up, deployed whenever she was losing an argument or facing consequences. Usually, it worked effectively to shift attention from the issue at hand to her distress. This time, however, it failed to achieve its purpose. The paramedics who were called examined her thoroughly and found her vital signs completely normal. Ma'am, you appear to be experiencing anxiety, not a cardiac event, the paramedic explained, loud enough for those nearby to hear. I recommend following up with your doctor, but there's no emergency requiring hospitalization. The humiliation of having her performance publicly debunked seemed to affect my mother more deeply than the court's ruling. As she and my father left the courtroom, she kept her head down, avoiding the gazes of spectators who had witnessed both the verdict and the failed medical drama. Jessica squeezed my shoulder. Congratulations, Rachel. It's over. But it wasn't, not really. The legal battle had concluded in my favor, but the emotional aftermath was just beginning. In the weeks that followed, my parents launched a campaign to salvage their reputation and punish me for my betrayal. Family gatherings became battlegrounds of competing narratives, with my parents portraying themselves as victims of an ungrateful daughter's greed. Rachel always was difficult, even as a child, my mother told anyone who would listen. We tried so hard with her, but she's always been resentful of our success. Some family members accepted this version of events, particularly those who had benefited from my parents' generosity over the years. Others, however, began to question the narrative they had accepted about my parents. My victory in court forced many to reconsider incidents from the past that had been explained away or minimized. Aunt Barbara called me 2 weeks after the verdict. "I always knew something wasn't right with how they treated you," she admitted. But it was easier to go along with their version of reality than to challenge it. "I'm sorry, Rachel. I should have seen the truth sooner." Even my boss, Mr. Daniels, approached me differently now. "Rachel, I owe you an apology," he said during a private meeting. "Your father contacted me directly about your employment here. He implied there would be consequences for the firm if we continued to support you. I shouldn't have allowed that pressure to influence our professional relationship." The most shocking development came when my parents' financial situation began to unravel. The court-ordered restitution required them to liquidate assets, including their vacation property. During this process, additional financial irregularities came to light, including tax discrepancies my father had carefully concealed for years. "They've been living beyond their means for a long time," Jessica explained, reviewing the financial disclosures. "They used your trust fund to maintain a lifestyle they couldn't actually afford. Now it's all coming apart." My initial reaction to their troubles was complicated. Part of me felt vindicated, even satisfied, that they were finally facing consequences for their actions. Another part felt an ingrained sense of responsibility for their well-being, the result of years of conditioning to believe that their happiness was my obligation. "That's normal," my therapist assured me. "They trained you to prioritize their needs above your own. Breaking that pattern takes time." I struggled with how much mercy to show. When I learned they were leveraging their house to pay the judgment, my first impulse was to reduce the amount to spare them this hardship. Jessica advised against it. "Rachel, you're not responsible for the consequences of their actions. They made deliberate choices to defraud you. Natural consequences are how adults learn." She was right, but it was difficult to overcome 2 decades of conditioning. I compromised by offering a payment plan that would allow them to meet their obligations without losing their home, but maintained the full amount of restitution. It was a boundary that respected both the court's judgment and my own emerging sense of justice tempered with compassion. My parents responded to this offer with typical manipulation, alternating between rejected indignation, "We don't need your charity," and martyred acceptance, "See how we continue to sacrifice for you, even now?" Their inability to simply acknowledge wrongdoing and accept reasonable consequences confirmed I had made the right decision. 3 months after the verdict, I received an unexpected visitor at my apartment. My father's sister, Aunt Catherine, whom I hadn't seen in years due to a family rift, stood at my door with a small package. "Your grandmother asked me to give you this if things ever came to a head with your parents," she explained. "I should have done it years ago, but I was a coward. I didn't want to deal with the fallout." The package contained letters my grandmother had written to me but never sent, detailing her concerns about my parents' controlling behavior and her hopes that the trust would eventually help me break free. The final letter, dated just weeks before her death, read, "My dearest Rachel, if you're reading this, you've discovered the truth about the trust and found the strength to claim your independence. I'm so sorry we couldn't protect you better. Your grandfather and I saw what was happening but felt powerless to intervene directly without making things worse for you. This money is more than an inheritance, it's your chance at the life you deserve, not the one your parents prescribed. I love you, not for who they tried to make you, but for who you truly are. Be brave, be free, and most of all, be yourself." Reading her words, I finally broke down and wept, grieving not just for my grandmother, but for the years lost to my parents' control, for the person I might have been without their constraints, and for the genuine parental love I had never experienced from them. That night, I made a list of all I had lost and all I had gained through this painful journey. The losses were significant: family relationships, innocence, trust. But the gains were transformative: freedom, self-determination, and most importantly, the truth. No longer would I live in the carefully constructed reality my parents had built around me. Now I could create my own. Have you ever experienced that moment when family karma finally catches up to someone who thought they'd never face consequences? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments. The journey to justice in family situations is never straightforward, and sharing our experiences helps others feel less alone. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to support more content about family dynamics, boundaries, and healing. Thank you for accompanying me through this difficult chapter of my life, and I hope the lessons I've learned might help someone else recognize and escape manipulation. 6 months after the court's ruling, my life had transformed in ways I never could have imagined. The restitution of my trust fund, plus interest and penalties, had provided me with the financial independence my grandparents had intended. More importantly, I had established firm boundaries with my parents, communicating only through occasional emails and declining their initial attempts to resume our former relationship without acknowledgement of their actions. "We're family, Rachel," my mother wrote in one message. "Surely we can move past this unfortunate misunderstanding." I replied simply, "This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate violation of trust. I'm open to rebuilding our relationship, but only with honesty and respect for my autonomy." Their responses vacillated between defensive justification and reluctant concessions, but I remained firm. For perhaps the first time in my life, I was setting the terms of our interaction rather than submitting to theirs. With my financial situation secured, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. I resigned from Kingston accounting to pursue art, my long-suppressed passion. I enrolled in classes at the local art institute and converted my spare bedroom into a studio. "I don't know if I can make a career of this," I told Jessica over coffee one day, "but for the first time, I'm doing something because I want to, not because someone else decided it was appropriate for me." Jessica had become more than my attorney through this process. She was now a trusted friend and mentor. That's the real victory here, Rachel. Not the money, but the freedom to choose your own path. I allocated a portion of my recovered funds to establish a scholarship in my grandparents' names at the local community college, specifically for students pursuing artistic studies despite family pressures to choose more conventional paths. It felt like the perfect way to honor their intent while helping others facing situations similar to mine. My parents initially reacted to my career change with predictable disdain. "Art," my father scoffed in an email. "After all the advantages we gave you, you're throwing away a professional career for a hobby?" I didn't bother responding. His opinion no longer determined my worth, and that realization was liberating. The most unexpected development came 3 months into my new pursuits, when my parents began couples therapy, reportedly at the insistence of my father's law partners after his courtroom outburst led to professional concerns. I learned this from Aunt Barbara, who maintained relationships with both sides of the family divide. "It's not a complete transformation," she cautioned. "But the therapist is apparently challenging some of their long-held patterns. Your father actually admitted he might have been too controlling with you." Might have been? I couldn't help laughing at the understatement. "Baby steps, Rachel. Remember, they've been this way for decades. Change won't happen overnight, if it happens at all." She was right to temper my expectations. Still, the fact that they were seeing a professional at all represented a shift I wouldn't have predicted. Meanwhile, I continued my own therapy, unpacking the patterns of my childhood and learning to identify the subtle ways my parents' manipulation had shaped my thinking. The process was painful but necessary, allowing me to recognize and begin dismantling the invisible constraints that had limited me for so long. As part of my healing, I reached out to childhood friends my parents had discouraged or forbidden. Reconnecting with Eliza, my best friend from elementary school until my parents deemed her family unsuitable, was particularly meaningful. "I never understood why you suddenly stopped being friends with me," she admitted during our first meeting as adults. Your mother told my mother that you'd decided to focus on more academically oriented friendships. That was never true, I told her. They made that decision, not me. I missed you terribly. Rebuilding these connections helped restore pieces of myself that had been suppressed under my parents' control, revealing a fuller, more authentic Rachel than I had been allowed to become. Perhaps the most significant change was my decision to purchase and renovate my grandparents' home when it came on the market. The modest ranch house held my happiest childhood memories, and preserving it felt right. Using my recovered funds, I updated the essential systems while maintaining the character my grandparents had loved. On the day I moved in, Jessica helped me carry the last boxes from the truck. Standing in the living room, surrounded by a mixture of my grandparents' preserved furniture and my own newer pieces, I felt an overwhelming sense of rightness. They would be so proud of you, Jessica said, seeming to read my thoughts. Not just for standing up to my parents? For becoming your own person. That's what they wanted for you all along. I nodded, running my hand over my grandmother's reading chair. I feel them here, you know? Not in a ghostly way, but in the sense that I'm continuing something they started. They planted seeds of independence in me during those weekends I spent here. It just took longer for those seeds to grow than they probably hoped. In the following weeks, I established new routines in my grandparents' home, now my home. I converted my grandfather's workshop into an extended art studio with north-facing windows for optimal light. I planted flowers in my grandmother's garden beds. I hosted small gatherings of new and reconnected friends, filling the house with laughter and conversation. 5 months after moving in, I received a letter from my parents. Unlike their previous communications, this one contained no justifications, no subtle manipulations, no attempts to rewrite history. Instead, it offered something I had never received from them before, an acknowledgement of harm. Our therapist has encouraged us to take responsibility for our actions, the letter read. While this process is difficult and ongoing, we recognize that we controlled rather than nurtured you, that we prioritized our desires for your life over your own, and that we betrayed your trust in the matter of your inheritance. These actions were wrong. We understand that words alone cannot repair the damage we've caused, and we respect whatever boundaries you need to maintain. If you are ever open to working toward a healthier relationship, we are committed to doing that work. I read the letter several times, searching for the hidden hooks, the subtle blame shifting, the veiled expectations I had learned to detect in their communications. Finding none, I felt cautiously optimistic yet realistic. A single letter didn't erase decades of behavior, but it suggested a capacity for change I hadn't believed they possessed. My response was measured. I acknowledged their effort, expressed appreciation for their participation in therapy, and maintained my boundary of limited contact while leaving the door open to gradual rebuilding if their changed behavior proved consistent. That evening, sitting in my grandmother's chair with a cup of tea, I reflected on the journey of the past year. I had lost the parents I had always wished for but never truly had. I had gained the independence my grandparents had tried to provide. I had discovered strengths I never knew I possessed and a voice I had been afraid to use. The money mattered, certainly. It had provided options and opportunities one wouldn't otherwise have had. But the real inheritance from my grandparents was something more valuable, the example of their unconditional love, the quiet resistance they had modeled against my parents' control, and ultimately, the tools they had provided for my liberation. As I looked around the home that had passed from them to me, I felt a profound sense of peace. The future stretched before me, uncertain but full of possibilities that were, for the first time, truly mine to choose. The greatest inheritance my grandparents left wasn't the money. It was the courage to stand up for myself, even against the people who were supposed to love me most. And that's something no one can ever take away. Thank you for staying with me through this entire journey. If my story has touched you or reminded you of your own family experiences, I'd be grateful if you'd share those in the comments. Has anyone else discovered that standing up for yourself sometimes means facing the people who were supposed to protect you? Your likes and subscriptions help stories like mine reach others who might be struggling with similar family dynamics. Remember that healing from family trauma is possible, and sometimes, as in my case, justice does eventually come. I'd be honored if you'd subscribe for more stories about finding your voice and reclaiming your power in difficult family situations.